Teachers at Reddit. Who are the students you remember from 5, 10, 20 years ago and what did they do to be remembered? 20 years ago there was a little girl in my class who was rather plump, plain, never spoke and didn't have many friends. I'm only saying this to describe the sort of kid she was. One day she was slow to pack away and it was just me and her in the classroom. I had a big bag of sweets and asked her if she'd like one. She very nervously said yes and I said she could only have one if she stopped and talked to me while we had them. We had a lovely chat about her dog and her family and I picked a book off my shelf I thought she'd like to read. Every week after that she'd hang back. We'd share some sweets or whatever either of us had in our lunchbox and we'd talk about things. After a few months of this she said, "I hope you don't mind giving up your break," and I said to her, "I look forward to it. The class is so big we don't get time to talk and I haven't got a daughter so this is lovely." And the year ended she had another teacher but she'd still pop in and say hello. Less and less often as she made friends and grew in confidence. 6 months ago I bumped into her while out shopping. I gave her a big hug. She said she remembers being very lonely at 11 but talking to me gave her something to look forward to. She went to university and was now a primary school teacher, and she always keeps sweets in her desk. In my 30 years of teaching, there are many students I remember for a wide variety of reasons. However, the story that readers may find somewhat interesting concerns a student in my AP physics class about 6 years ago. She was always on her phone whenever there was even 1 minute of downtime, and she was always laughing when looking at her phone. Finally, I asked her, "What the hell is always so funny?" And that's how I discovered and got hooked on Reddit. 5 years ago, a senior that was a barely getting by usually failing didn't give a crap kid talked back. Total ass that was going into the Marines like his dad and certainly wasn't interested in web design but had to take a tech course. I could eventually tell he was just trying to be a badass for the girl next to him that was a complete bad girl. So I separated them at the end of first 6 weeks and I somehow got him interested. He became one of the best in the class. I have no idea how I did it but something clicked. They eventually did a group project making a website for a business idea from one of my other classes. Not only did he lead the team and make an awesome site, but he helped the team from the other class with their business idea. Finished my class with an A. He said his first A since elementary school. I was so damn proud. I knew he would never use the ability to do web design in the Marines but maybe it showed him he could succeed. I now live to do that for another kid. Edit. Thanks for all the upvotes. I completely understand technology is used immensely in armed forces. My brother does quite a bit. I just meant that student wasn't going to. He had already chosen his direction. Edit 2. Thanks for the gold. Threatened to kill me my first lesson in the school 10 years on he's just been put in prison for robbing an old lady and breaking her hand. Classy. I coached swimming for a prep school, so although you wouldn't classify me a teacher, I taught. I worked with a kid who was literally the most intelligent, skilled, and hardworking individual I had ever met. Still to this day, his parents were wealthy, so in addition to normal practice, they paid for me to train him one-on-one in the mornings. The pool opened at 5 AM. I would usually arrive at 4:55 AM. His parents put the accountability in him, and so he wouldn't wake them up in the morning. He would ride his bike, no matter what the weather forecast was. Not only that, but I never beat him to the pool. He was always waiting for me when I arrived. We would go over the plan for the day, and most often, he would change the intervals and distances to make them more challenging. The thing was, I was already making the workout as hard as possible. Fast forward to last week, as a freshman in scholarship to Stanford, he recently broke the Pac-12 record for fastest mile ever swam at the championships. We keep up on social media, and I know that he'll be incredibly successful later on in life. I will always remember 2 students I had 10 years ago, a girl and a boy. They were senior year of high school and about to graduate. They were dating and she was pregnant with his baby. I had a great relationship with them both and I had hopes they would make excellent parents. She went into labor in the middle of my class and he had to rush her out. They came to my wedding last year with their 9-year-old child. Edit. A word. No longer a teacher by 5 years ago I was teaching freshman English and this kid just was not doing any work. I didn't want to fail him and tried to meet with him and figure out what was going on. I suspected home issues. He kept saying he had a lot going on and that he would do the work, he was just distracted. Finally contact the mom because he is not doing anything and I'm worried he is going to fail. She emails me this long email that basically said her kid was a crafty asshole who could sell ice to an Eskimo and not to trust anything he says. The same paragraph proceeded to tell me, well, he did become a father in the fall, so he has had his hands full with that. WTF lady. I was more concerned about the blasé registered sign way she talked about her 14-year-old reproducing. When I was newly qualified, I had a huge class of 36 pupils. I had one boy who was returning from the local pupil referral unit for behavior support. He had been through a really rough childhood and had awful attachment disorder issues. I remember on the first day I met him we had to evacuate the room because he was trashing it. I spent a lot of time working with him. When he started with me he could barely write his name. By the end of the year he was writing stories. It took a lot of work but he trusted me, so was willing to try. He was a lovely kid. That was nearly 10 years ago now. He'd be 18 now. Not my own story as a teacher, though I am one as well, but a story I heard from one of my high school teachers. F was teaching oral interpretation at that time, basically a class on giving speeches. And there was this one student, we'll call him Billy. Whenever there was any category of speech, Billy would always find some way to give a bizarre and slightly macabre speech that still technically fit the requirements. When the class had to give a speech on how to do something, Billy demonstrated a procedure to build a miniature guillotine and used it on a Barbie doll in front of the class. It worked. When the class had to give a persuasive speech, Billy gave a speech about why OJ was actually innocent. But the real kicker was when the students had to give an informative speech about one of their hobbies. Billy discussed at length his hobby of taking the daily obituary from the paper and crossing the dead people out of the phone book. He proceeded to show off his phone book with name after name of now deceased individuals crossed out. I had a student with cerebral palsy in my British Lit class. I knew on day one that we'd get along because he was one of the few who laughed at my Monty Python reference. Dude was in a wheelchair and was in foster care, but he never complained or made excuses. He busted ass on all of his assignments, participated in group work and class discussions, and had a wicked sense of humor. I got to choose a student of the month, and I chose him. Come to find out that it was the first time he'd ever been honored for academics in school. Even though he was intelligent and a good student, I'm fortunate that I had an opportunity to be his teacher and get to know him. During my teaching internship, there was one kid who was very bright, performed at the top of the class, but was clearly stoned half the time. He was one of a very few disadvantaged minority kids in a very affluent white school district. One day, he adjusts his hoodie and a joint falls out onto the floor at my feet. He sees it, I see it, and nobody else does. I looked him in the eye and gave him a "you dumbass" look as I stepped on the joint to hide it and then said something to direct everybody's eyes to the board so he could pick it up and I could pretend I never saw it. I didn't sign up to be a drug sniffing dog, and wasn't going to be the first positive role model to turn this kid over to law enforcement for punishment that could screw him over for life. That was the day I decided I had to teach in an alternative education environment. 5 years ago, I hosted an 8th grade study hall and classroom, a computer lab. Study hall is a joke, so as long as students stayed docile and had something out in front of them, I was happy. Computers were only allowed to be used for work. One student was looking to write an essay on Microsoft Word. I approved. He sat in the seat where I couldn't see his screen. Big mistake. Towards the end of study hall, he gathered a crowd around his computer. I went to go investigate. Upon arrival, I see a "thank you for your order" screen on Amazon for $15,000 worth of computer parts. The kicker? The credit card he used to order the parts was found on a website that had an inventory of stolen credit card numbers. Teacher for 7 years now. Special education. My kids are all fairly memorable in their own ways, but there are certain kids that come to mind much easily than others and with more frequency. For me, it is a little boy with Down syndrome who I think of involuntarily almost daily, and to be honest, I feel slightly ashamed of the why. He was a kindergartner and just learning to count. He had very limited verbal abilities, and while he was working with a speech language pathologist, during math time our focus was math and not speech, and the way he counted was unique. He couldn't pronounce the numbers correctly, but once he mastered counting to 10, he counted everything and loudly. 1, 2, we, bear, by, see, arshi, nan, pa. Each sound overemphasized and stretched out. I work out regularly, and in working out, counting your sets is fairly standard. At the time, his counting just stuck in my head when I'd be doing my sets. To this day, I cannot count anything in my head without counting in his voice, especially when I'm working out. I have a feeling this will never go away. I teach 3rd grade. When I give spelling tests, I tell the kids they can doodle on the back in between words. A super bright, creative girl used to write me Star Wars quizzes on the back of her tests instead. Now, some of the more curious kids sometimes write questions that I'd answer, but these quizzes were on another level entirely. Who did Han shoot in the Mos Eisley Cantina? And what is Leia's home planet? Are a couple examples. She then include cute little doodles of the characters involved in the questions. As a huge Star Wars fan myself, possibly not as big a fan as this student though, I will never ever forget these amazing quizzes and their amazing creator. Just last week a student disclosed to me that she was living away from home in a sort of youth hostel. Although she was safe, she said she was really struggling with money and would often stay home from college, UK, because she was too hungry. I sorted her a food parcel out for the next day, and she said she was so excited to be carrying a heavy bag of food home and she would finally be able to afford tampons. I cried when she'd gone. About 7 years ago, when I was a mainstream 1st grade teacher, I had a little girl I wished I could take home. She was being raised by her grandmother, who was about 75 and also raising several of the girl's cousins. Her mother was in the throes of addiction, and the grandmother, while doing her best, was clearly overwhelmed and in way over her head. She was provided the basics: roof over her head, fed, and appropriately clothed. But when she first started school, she was like a little wildling. She was so unsocialized, and no one had taught her anything academic. She didn't know letters, numbers, shapes, or how to write her own name, and she was starving for affection. I loved her so much, because she was so eager and so sweet, even if she would quickly put any kids who got in her way on the ground. I lost track of her after she moved on to middle school, but last I heard, she wasn't doing well, very angry and out of control, and I don't know if her grandmother is still even alive, so who knows who she lives with now. If she had ended up in different circumstances, she had so much to offer. Breaks my heart. I only taught for a year, and remember lots of students, but my favorite has to be the 4th grade girl who had creative life goals. The other girls wanted to be nurses or dancers when they grew up, but this girl wrote that she wanted to be a bounty hunter obstetrician. I still get a good laugh out of that one. I honestly can remember all of my students, but the ones that pop up in my head from time to time are the ones I had an especially positive weird interaction with. 1. The student who told me she was a lesbian and wouldn't stop giving me hints that she wanted to hang out with me after school or during the summer. 2. The mentally impaired student who would make casual death threats to anybody for any random reason. Example: "Oh, that would be a shame if the next exam is hard and we would find you beaten in the parking lot." Edit. Thanks. I learned a lot of vocabulary. My first year teaching 5 years ago, I taught 6th grade, which is still in the elementary school in my district. I'll never forget Caden. I used a classroom money system where kids earned money for doing jobs, making good choices, etc. They could pay out for sitting on the couch I had in the classroom or for auctions at the end of the quarter, etc. We were walking back in from the school spelling bee, and I hear Caden say to a classmate, "How could Garrett misspell paprika?" I had a lot of money riding on him winning. Turns out they had a black market going with my classroom cash. They'd gamble during indoor recess, bring in snacks to sell at lunch, and apparently made bets on the school spelling bee. As much as I thought it was hilarious, I had to have the obligatory "you're 12 years old and can't gamble" with our classroom money talk. It was a year full of stuff like that with this kid, always entertaining. And his dad was hot. He was known amongst teachers as Hot Dad. Memorable year. Good kid. Ha. Edit. Of course. There's also the girl who, when I moved the 4th grade the next year, wrote out how to kill as part of a creative writing assignment. That one was graphic. Or the girl who wrote out a list of white girls who are itches followed by I have one word for Mrs. Always the moon, itch. Those were fun. Not a teacher, but I was, and still am, earning my pocket money in my middle school by being a math tutor. I once had a student who could perfectly tell and answer to almost any math problem, but she couldn't show how she got there. She just knew. But her teacher, despite correct answers, always was giving her F for no thoughts process. 2 years. 2H a week teaching how to write her thoughts. Good times. Now she is on math physics class and she don't need my help, but we are still in contact. I explained to him that the meaning of the word futile was something equivalent to hitting an exposed steel I-beam in the back of my classroom, as in, there was no point. He said, "What do you mean? Like this?" and punched it as hard as he could. Broke his hand. My GF's first year of teaching, and she taught nonverbal severely autistic kids. She worked really hard with these for 7 and 8 years, through their meltdowns and seizures. One parent's evening she was showing the parents some of their art, and they pointed at the child's name and asked who wrote it. She said the child did, and they started crying, saying they did not think the kid would ever achieve something this simple. It was a good day. Shortly prior to my wife beginning her teaching career at a private school, she worked there for 14 more years. A student had kidnapped one of the few children of color, tied him up, and called him his slave and the N-word, etc. I will have to verify what happened to the kid. His parents were billionaires or something like that. I know the child who got tied up continued to attend the school, and his father was a police officer. Hopefully his tuition was free. If there is enough interest, I will get the name of the kid who did the slave thing and see what he's up to now. The kid who was tied up is kicking serious ass in life, career, etc. Update. My wife will ask a friend for the name of the student and I will see if I can track them down. She doesn't remember. However, she did add some details. The incident occurred at recess against the kid's will. So the kidnapping thing is something I remember hearing from someone else. He tied the other student, the only black child at the school, up to a basketball pole and called him his slave and the N-word. My wife guesses that the other student is likely went to a great college and parents bought him out of any trouble, but will verify. I had to teach my childhood bully's son. He was just like his dad, a stupid jock walking around like as it didn't stink. Woefully ignorant of how he was destined to peak during high school and then go on to do nothing noteworthy after that. He turned out to be an alright kid in the end though. I never really got to tell him because I was killed by some wizard's pet snake. Alex. Not sure what condition he had, but he was kinda slow. On a class trip, overnight at some camp, some of the guys were kinda messing with him. Alex. Do you beat your meat? I will not be beaten by the meat. Poor kid had no idea what it meant. Another kid, Brad, was under his sheet and started to exaggerate a jerk-off motion. You could clearly see his hand motion. Alex. I'm beating my meat. I will not be beaten by the meat. And jumped on Brad and punched him right in the D. Edit. I just noticed the question asked for teachers. To clarify, I was a student, not a teacher. I had a student stand up in the middle of class and mimic what he would do if he was a Nazi surrounded by Jews. The last I heard, he ended up in jail for animal cruelty and domestic violence. Not me, but a good friend. Was his first year teaching Spanish in a not so great area. First day goes around class asking kids their names etc. Comes to one kid, says his name, but then informs my buddy that his rap name is Biddy. Tells him that if he comes up to the front of the class and laid it down that he would call him that. Apparently he was pretty good. So Biddy it was. Edit. A word. Apparently is not spelled apparently. I was a volunteer English teacher in a prison. I taught the college prep courses, basics of essay format, composition and evidence-based writing. One of my guys was blatantly bipolar, and his writing was brilliant, but he kept failing. Just couldn't hold it together through the term. Had something like a decade left on a 30-year sentence. A few years later, I'm walking to work and bam, There he is working with the street cleanup team. Sure enough, he'd been diagnosed bipolar, was on stable meds, holding a job and going to school. TLDR, dude sorta spent 22 years in prison for having an untreated mental illness. Not a teacher, but a student of one. When I was in high school, I suggested to the teacher that if a student can get a 90 or better on a test, they can be excused the absence of one homework. She had a policy of every time you missed a homework assignment, you got a point off your final grade. Fast forward a decade, I was visiting my parents and they asked me to pick us something from the supermarket. I ran into her in the aisle. She came, said, "Hi Rob 132. I just want to tell you that I've kept your policy in place of a 90 or higher on a test to make up for a missed homework. And every year I tell the students about it and I always mentioned your name. It really helped some kids study more to make up on missed homeworks. The worst part is I never got to use it. I only got in the mid-80s. Math wasn't my thing." Not a teacher, but I'll tell you about a time a teacher actually remembered me 18 plus years later. So I was selling shoes at Macy's at the time when I was in college and this little old lady approached me asking for a size. I went back to get it for her and saw her sitting next to a couple of older women her age. I took them to her and let her know if she needed anything else to please let me know. "Why thank you, disoriented possum. That's very nice of you. You have grown up a lot," said the woman next to her. I remember thinking, how the duck does she know my name because I wasn't wearing my name tag that day? I looked at her and studied her face and it snapped. "MRS? B?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "I knew it was you when I first saw you. You look and sound much like your mother." It was MRS B, my pre-kindergarten teacher's assistant. I thanked her for the compliment and later checked out her friend, gave her a hug and bid her farewell. It was a very touching moment for me. I wish I had asked her what it was about me that she remembered my name and who I was. I guess I'll never know. Nearly 15 years ago, I worked in an absolutely horrific department. One morning, before school started, I had the pleasure of being told how a teacher I was by my head of department. I'm not. Needless to say, I was cut up and spent most of the morning crying on and off. Just before I was due to teach my year 11s, 3 of the girls found me crying. One of them stayed with me, one of them blocked the doorway to refuse entry to anyone else, and one of them ran off to the loo to get me a tissue. These were the hard nuts of the school, the ones that were dumped on me because their year 10 teacher couldn't handle them. I will never ever forget the kindness they showed me on that day. I wonder where they are now.